So my name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors here on staff at Journey, and we are in the middle of, no, we're not. We are starting. We are not in the middle of anything. We are starting the series this morning called Lentish, and for those of you who grew up with Lent and were a part of a community that celebrated, I was not. I was not part of a church that celebrated Lent, but I grew up in a town that did. I grew up in a small town that basically there was a large Catholic church in town that had thousands and thousands of people that attended it. The town was about 10,000 people, and so half the town was Catholic, 3/4 of the rest of the town was Lutheran, and then there was this little Baptist church and a little Assembly of God church. The Assembly of God church, nobody knew what to do with. Sorry about that. Scared everybody in town. They met at the high school. Anyway, different story. But as I was growing up in that community, oftentimes during this season, kids would show up at school and they would have an ash mark on their forehead from Ash Wednesday. And as kids would do, what is that? You know, so we would start having conversations, and usually the conversation kind of went like this. Oh, yeah, went to church. They put this cross on you, and then you got to give something up. I'm like, what? You got to give something up? And they'd be like, yeah, my parents said I had to give up candy until Easter. I was like, time out. So they literally would give up, and they would complain about it for weeks. Like, yeah, I can't. And a big thing up there in Minnesota was they would give up meat on Fridays, except for they would have these big fish fries, which I personally really enjoyed. The fish fries were amazing. But I was part of this little Baptist church. Well, we didn't do that. And I remember going home, having a conversation with my parents, my mom mostly, and say, hey, what's the deal with this? Because from my perspective as a kid growing up was they would explain it in this way that in my little ears would hear this. We're trying to get into God's good graces. We're trying to get God to smile on us. We're trying to get God to be for us. So we're giving up something of great value so that God will be happy with us. And I was like, maybe we ought to do this. Because from a kid's perspective, it was like, that sounds like a good idea in and of itself. But they missed the point. They missed the point of Lent. They missed the point of giving something up. But in the minds of most of the people that I was involved with in relationship, that's how they described it. And so as I got a little bit older, I began to understand it better. But what was confusing to me as well was they would go through this whole season of Lent, and they couldn't wait until Easter because right after that, they went back to everything being normal. And so the disruption of that didn't have a lasting effect. So there was this degree of, I don't really get it, I don't understand it. And so as I grew up and moved away, I never, as a Protestant, my whole life, I've never really celebrated Lent. I've never participated in it, never saw the reason for it. I've read about it, I studied it, I knew why it existed, but never did it. And so here I am, leading off a series called Lentish, and we're going to kind of dive into this as a community of believers to move down this path of asking good questions around this idea of how does participating in some form of Lent help us in our walk with Jesus? How does this move us along as we prepare ourselves for Resurrection Sunday? And so really, that is the point. The point is, in some form or fashion, we disrupt our routines in such a way that allows Jesus to invade our routines, our lives, in such a way that it prepares us for Resurrection Sunday. Because we all know how the story ends. We all know that on Easter Sunday, we celebrate that our God did the most amazing thing ever. He comes back to life. He conquers our greatest fear. He beats the one foe no one ever beats. He beats death. And with that, we celebrate. We celebrate because the uniqueness of our God is that not only is he the author of life, he's the destroyer of death. And so as we go through this and we prep for that Sunday, I love Easter, my favorite day of the year. It is the day that we celebrate what makes us so crazy unique as Christians. We actually believe that somebody died on a cross for us and rose from the dead. And it changes history, it changes our lives, and it changes everything about us, as it is the depth of which we find our identity and our being. So I want to invite you into that. I want to invite you into this idea that as we go through these 40 days together, that there is something that you can participate in that draws you into a deeper relationship with Jesus through the disruption of your routine. Because oftentimes our routines are designed by us to kind of keep God in a box or keep God at bay, because we've got a pretty good routine going and we really don't need him. And so we voluntarily then move into a space by, and most people would say, most people who participate in Lent, and we want to invite you into this. I don't care if you started on Wednesday or not. Throughout this time, and the next day is always the first day that you can participate. So don't think, well, I didn't start with you on Wednesday, I didn't start with you today, I don't care. I don't care if you start on the day before Good Friday. It is to disrupt your routine so that God can invade. And for some of us, that might be we give up food. For some of us, it might be we give up complaining. For some of us, it might mean that we start complaining. I don't know. But I want to invite you into this so that there is a degree of we're doing this together as a community. And so that's what we're going to be doing over these next few weeks. And so the basis of Lent is rooted in the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness. And so as we kind of kick this off, I want to start there. I want to invite you to read along or Matthew 4, 1 through 11. Follow along. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city, Jerusalem, had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended to him. This idea of temptation is where we begin. It begins in the place where Jesus goes into the wilderness, and that is the 40 days that we are kind of commemorating as we go through Lent. And it is the reminder of the sacrifice of Jesus, but it's also the reminder that Jesus can identify with us. But I want to take you down a quick path of what it means to be tempted, what it means to be somehow enticed. I think sometimes we forget or we don't really engage in this idea of temptation that often because we've built routines. And in our routines, temptation is the thing that either we've built our routine to comply with our temptation or we've built our routine to not comply with our temptations. And so with that, I want to invite you into this idea that the battle of temptation is in the mind. It's not in your behavior. It's actually what's taking place in your mind. And so with that, it matters what we think about. It matters what we dwell on. There's a verse in Philippians 4:8. It says this. He says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." In the original language, it says dwell on these things. Dwelling is the turning over in the mind. It is the allowing the mind to sit in these things. And oftentimes we go through life passively without really taking into account what we're dwelling on. And really, that is the essence of temptation. The essence of temptation is we allow it to go into the mind, and the mind dwells on it. And the mind is the beginning of action. The mind is the beginning of behavior because it influences the heart, and we live out of the overflow of the heart. And so the more we dwell on something, the more we think of something, the more that we want to do it, the more that there's a propensity that we will follow through and do it. And we all inherently know to some degree that that is a truism. The truism is, unless, of course, we are somehow influenced compulsively by a peer. And that's basically middle school and high school. There is a degree of which, and it happens even with adults, but there is a degree of influence that takes place from people around us. And I would say that's the world influences us, the spirit world influences us, and there's these degree of influences, but most of the time there's a degree of takes place in the mind. And so with that, it matters what we dwell on. Temptation is a conflict. Temptation is a conflict that takes place in your mind. And so you will, in many ways, take thoughts into your mind, and you will make an instant decision about that. And this is how it kind of works. It kind of works this way around the idea of, let's just say, for argument's sake, I'm going to find it here in my notes because I just jumped ahead. The thought pops into your mind, and it is, I am so angry with so-and-so. That's your thought. And I want to fill in the blank. I want to beat them. I want to berate them. I want to do something to them because I'm so angry. See, that thought comes into mind, and you have a choice. The battle rages in your mind between, what am I going to do with that thought? Most of the time, we take the thought and we compare it to, okay, this is what really happened. We kind of dismiss it. We do work on it in our minds. And then we don't do what we want to do. We don't hit anybody. We don't yell at them. And so anger becomes controlled in the temptation stage if we are taking our mind seriously and we take these thoughts to some degree captive. If we don't and we allow them to go to fruition, then we act on them. And then we have to apologize. And then we end up in this place where I acted on a thought I shouldn't have acted on. That's what takes place in the mind. And really, temptation is won and lost in those moments. It's won and lost in the mind as you're thinking about it. So let's just look at this real quick, how Jesus handles temptation. There's 3 temptations that are presented to him, and the first one is pretty obvious. He's hungry. It even says it here. And the beauty of this is we begin to see God in the flesh, and this is really his humanity on display. And so he's in the wilderness. He had fasted for 40 days. The tempter comes to him and says, turn those stones into bread. And Jesus would be tempted to do that. Thus, temptation. Now, there's a lot of things going on here that we have to kind of take by faith, is that Jesus is in fact God in the flesh, and that Jesus is fully man. And so he experiences this temptation to its fullest. And can you imagine not eating for 40 days, possessing the power to turn anything you want into food, anything you want into food, and any kind of food you want, and then have someone tell you in your mind, in your ear, you're God, go ahead. That's tempting. And so the temptation is real. And it is the idea that the tempter is trying to get him to fulfill his needs outside of God. He's trying to get, and this is oftentimes how it works with us. It is to get our needs met apart from God. It's one of the underlying temptations that we have. It is that I will fix my own problem. I will solve my own problem. I'm not going to bother God with my problem. I'm not going to lean into this, so I will, in my own flesh, in my own way, fix the problem that is in front of me. And hunger is a real need. Hunger is something that is actually an appetite. And appetites are something that keep us alive. If you don't get hungry once in a while, you don't eat. Hunger is by design a part of being human. And so, but it also is a part of us that often gets abused. Our appetites are what get abused because we overdo it. When I was young, I don't even remember how old I was. I do remember the consequences of this pretty good. But it was a Christmas. My mom got a box of turtle chocolates. Do you know what turtles are? They're milk chocolate. They have pecans and they have caramel in them. Do you know what those are? And there was a 2-layered box of those. My dad got her those for Christmas. My mom said, "Hey, you want one of these?" And I said, "Yeah, I love candy. I'm all in on candy." Gave me one, and I was like, "These are amazing." So over the course of that day, I ate the whole box. The whole box. Now, there were consequences for eating my mom's Christmas present. That was painful. But there also was consequences physically for eating a whole. I probably weighed 70 pounds soaking wet at the moment. I mean, it wasn't pretty, the results of that physically. And so, but I couldn't stop. They were so good, I couldn't stop. Even when I was full of them, I couldn't stop. And I remember the question, why did you eat them all? Have you had one? So good. And I love candy. So as an adult, though, I still have this problem. Not with turtles, with red licorice. I cannot buy a bag of Twizzlers without eating the whole bag. So I literally have to buy a small bag of licorice, or I will literally eat like if I bought a pound bag, I'd eat the whole. Once you open it, you've got to eat it. And so that battle for me is lost instantaneously when I even start to dwell on, I could use some licorice. I have to go to the store for something. I will buy just a small bag of licorice, but since I'm here and it's really soft, I'll buy the little bigger bag of licorice. And then once it's open, though, it's like, I cannot stop. What is that? That is, I lose that battle when I start dwelling on the fact that I haven't had licorice in a while, and I don't dismiss it. The battle is lost in the mind. Is there something wrong with having a little bit of licorice? I don't think so. Is there something wrong with eating 2 pounds of licorice? Yeah, there's something wrong with that. Yep, there is. For those of you, and I'm not saying you all eat licorice. I'm saying there's something. There's something that in us says, oh, I could really, and I can't stop. That's how temptation works. That's how my mind works. That's how I go down paths I don't want to go down. And it's not that it is inherently wrong. It's not wrong for Jesus to eat. What's wrong about that, what the temptation is to fulfill this outside of God. So, and don't underestimate the subtle attempts to get you somehow down those paths. Even a sign will trigger something for me. I'll go, oh, because I lived in Hershey, Pennsylvania for 25 years. And there's Twizzler signs everywhere. They make them there. Twizzlers are made there. And they're so good there. Because they're fresh. So, you lost me for a minute. Where are we? What are we doing? So anyway. Okay. The distraction for me is real. But the battle takes place in our appetites. And so there it is. That's the idea. The second temptation is what we talk about a lot here, is really when he tempts him with throwing himself down on the rocks. If you really are the Son of God, do you hear what he's saying to him? Do you know who you are? That's what he's saying to Jesus. If you really knew who you were, you could throw yourself down on these and you wouldn't be harmed at all. You would be saved by the angels. He's tempting him with his identity, which we often get tempted with. Our temptation is not to believe our true identity in Christ. Our temptation is not to lean into that. And again, it is this idea of if you are who you say you are, then it doesn't matter. but it does matter. It's tempting God, but it's also discrediting his identity. So with that, that's the second of the temptations. And the third temptation, I think I just want to read it again because I think he states it in such a way that allows us to understand this idea of worship. It says, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. So he tempts him with all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. So what is good about everything in the world? All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Part of this is very ironic. Okay, part of this is that he's talking to God, but it is God in the flesh too, his humanness. And to say to God, I will give you everything you see, seems a little funny to me, that it's his anyway. You know, there's this weirdness to this one, but it's a worship question. It's not a possession question. And so when you start looking at it in terms of, I'm not giving it, it's not to own. He really wants Jesus to worship him. That's what he really wants. He's trying to bribe worship out of Jesus. And it's the same temptation we run into, is that there's a sense of, man, if you give me this, I'll worship. There's a correlation for us that oftentimes is transactional in worship. It's not meant to be, but it is. We're more inclined to worship when we feel like God is blessing us than we are when God is not blessing us. And we define blessing however we define that. And so worship, in essence, becomes an expression of the heart when we find ourselves in the right place with God in that transaction. And so what he's doing here is he's trying to get him to lean into and to worship the tempter, the devil. And so it's false worship. We all have temptations of false worship, and we all get lost in this. We all at times worship the creation rather than the creator. We oftentimes find ourselves giving time and money and energy and resources to things that we go at the end of the day, I think I missed it today. I think I missed really worshiping God, and I worshiped other things. It is part of our nature to worship. We're built for it. And so with that, what tugs at our heart is really moving us down these paths. So as we migrate through the 40 days leading into Easter, there is this idea that, okay, how do we disrupt our routines and still be aware of this idea of temptation? Because really what's going to happen is if you decide to give something up, it's going to reveal something about you. It's going to reveal your temptations. It's going to reveal some of your disunity in your walk with Jesus. And I think part of that is then going to be rooted in, how do I maintain relationship as I now have things revealed to me about my life that I need to change? And so for me, what I've chosen to do is I'm going to fast one meal a day. And so during that meal, I'm going to do some different things as I pray and interact with God. But what my goal is that in the absence of what is my normal routine, I am going to now step into other things with God. So what it's going to do is disrupt some things for me in my normal, ongoing, fluid routine of life. That's the goal of this. Now, there'll be a little bit of hunger tied to that. There'll be a little other things tied to that. But for me, the idea being, okay, I'm going to disrupt, and then I'm going to intentionally take that disruption and spend time with God. And so with that, that's the idea. That's the idea of being built into this. But what it's going to reveal is there are times when I'm going to be hungry and I'm going to be irritated and I'm not going to feel like it. And so with that also comes the exposure of the heart and the battle of the mind. And so with that, we are then invited into this relationship with Jesus, and the reason why he did the temptation and the reason why he went into the desert is found in Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Oftentimes what happens is in our failure of confronting our own temptations, when we fall into sin, when we do that, it causes distance between us and God. It's not created by us, it's not created by him, it's created by us. We're still in relationship with God, we're still forgiven, but we find ourselves not wanting to approach God because any number of reasons. One could be just shame. I feel ashamed. I don't want to be in the presence of God. It can be that I think I can hide from God. One of the first sins of man is he hides in the garden. And after he sins, he goes, whoa, we messed that up. We better hide. And hiding from God is an illusion. You can't hide from God, although I've tried. I think every human being in some form or fashion in their mind has come to the conclusion at some point in their lives, God won't know. But yet, he always knows. And so what he's trying to do in this passage, what he's trying to explain and what God did for us when he spent that time in the wilderness, but also throughout his human life, in his full humanity, he's experienced every kind of temptation known to humans. And he didn't sin. That in and of itself gives us empathy. But the him not sinning part also gives us hope. And then him not sinning and him empathizing also puts him in a place of being a perfect sacrifice. So it all kind of works together. And then it also works together in that last verse. I love this verse, 16. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. He's saying, literally, come to my throne. It's a throne of grace. And to understand grace is to understand that it doesn't matter what I did because there's grace. And I can come there. He knows he's experienced the temptation I've experienced, and he has empathy for me, and he has mercy for me, and he has grace for me, and he forgives me, and he says, come to me and I'll help you. Too many times we cut off the source of our help because we don't come to him. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish in this season. We're trying to accomplish, we break our routines. Our routines cannot help us. We break into this idea that we can go to the throne of grace. We can experience that with God, and he can help us. And it's crucial to understand that oftentimes we don't do it because we want to fix it ourselves. Oftentimes we don't go to the throne of grace. We don't go to Jesus because we figure, I've got it. I've figured this out. I've got it down. And that's actually the sin of pride. And so over this time, we really want to exercise this principle of going in to the throne of grace and understanding grace. And it applies to you. It applies to me. And we don't need to be filled with shame because grace overwhelms us. So the exercise of coming to Jesus with confidence is actually spiritually forming. And it's also combating lies with truth. Because once we start believing a lie about God, we create behaviors around it. That he won't receive me. I can't go into his presence. He's too holy. He just has wrath for me. And we have lists of things, and we go, okay, I can't do that. And that's a lie. And so the truth is, we're invited. We're invited into the throne of grace. We're invited into that relationship in such a way that his grace and mercy overwhelm us. You're invited. So we come to Jesus with the expectation that he understands our struggles and our plight. He actually gets us. He gets you. He gets me. He understands. And so we worship a God who understands. So let's just wrestle with this idea of temptation for a couple more minutes as we enter into this, because you're going to wrestle with it. Because if you don't wrestle with it, that means you've given into it. And if you've given into it, you've become passive to the battle. And if the battle is raging in the mind over temptation, I want to take you to a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Apostle Paul describes it this way. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. One of my favorite verses in the Bible. It is because it is such a clear picture, because the things that come into our minds sometimes just come into it passively, but sometimes they come into our minds and we dwell on it. And they become arguments and they become pretensions. They become things that set themselves up against the knowledge of God. So this requires us in some form or fashion to be rooted in the Word. Because if we're rooted in the Word, we're able to discern those things which are not of God and which things are. But this is the idea. The idea is that we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. We all get random thoughts. We all get them, and we usually dismiss them quickly. Like, I should just quit my job. Anybody just have a random thought like that pop into their head one day? Oh, come on. Am I the only one that just thinks that? Okay. But then, right, you go, okay, I need to think about that for a minute. If I quit my job, I don't get paid. I have to find another job, and who knows what that one's going to be like. And then you start to, and then you go, oh man, this ends with me being homeless. if you track it all the way down, right? And so you don't, right? You take the thought captive. I'm not going to quit my job. I'll keep doing my job. And we dismiss it. We compare it to the truth. We have this idea of how this works. We take a thought captive and we compare it to what we know is true, and we dismiss the thought. It is every parent's every day does this. Every day, I argue. Maybe not. Maybe you just don't think a lot. But there are moments in parenting when you go, I really want to do something to my child right now. And then you go, oh, that would be bad. But you start to process. You take that thought captive. You can have the emotion, but you start taking the thought captive and you start going, okay, I can't do that. And you dismiss it. You dismiss the thought. But there are thoughts that are so prevalent within us, we don't even recognize them anymore because we've built patterns around them. And they're called strongholds in the mind for a reason, because we just are instinctively doing them. Even if a thought feeds it, we do it. We all have thoughts like that play into our patterns. For me, it's candy or it's Twizzlers. Like, I don't know how to stop that pattern. Maybe for you, you're laying in bed, it's just one more, I'm going to hit the snooze button just one more time. And you're programmed to, okay, you don't have alarm clock. Alexa, 5 more minutes. But we build patterns. We don't even think about it anymore. I just want to sleep for 5 more minutes. I just want to sleep for 10 more minutes. Or you just glance, if you're a student, I'm just going to glance at that test, his test, so I can get a better answer. No one will know. You're filling out your IRS. The IRS is really understaffed right now. You're not going to get audited, so you cheat a little bit. See, you take those thoughts captive, or you don't, and you compare them to the truth. They're temptations that pop into your mind. I want to take you down a path that I struggle with. I mean, part of my life struggle is fear. I grew up afraid, and fear drives you to do things. Fear is one of those things that if you don't battle it, it'll control you. Just like anger will control you, or shame will control you, fear will control you. And so I found myself oftentimes making my decision out of fear, or how do I alleviate fear? And so for me, that was ongoing. And the most pressing thing right now that's happening around me that is causing people fear is this whole coronavirus. And I find myself talking to people about it, and I hear fear. And I've been asked, aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid of some? Lori and I are actually planning a trip. We planned a trip to, of all places, Italy. Aren't you afraid? And in the past, I would have been afraid because my pattern of my mind would have been, I'm afraid. But as I've learned how to capture that, and I'm inviting you into this, maybe yours is anger, but the underlying principle is that somehow, some way, I can control the outcome. Fear is rooted in a lack of control. Fear is rooted in this idea that somehow, some way, something's going to happen that I won't be able to control it. And then I compare that to the truth, and the truth is, that is true. I cannot control the outcome. I cannot control what will happen. I don't know what's going to happen an hour from now, let alone what's going to happen 6 months from now. But fear paralyzes. Fear puts you in a place where you don't trust God. And so once I started to recognize my fear was an absence of faith, I started to connect those two things. And I would make decisions out of fear, and I would find myself in places I didn't want to be. Or in my fear, like I would have a fear, and I would make it come true. People do this. I've talked to people that were in counseling, and they said, look, I'm afraid he's going to leave me. Okay? Is he? She worked hard to make sure that came true. People do that. They fulfill their fears. And that's a stronghold. That's a way that we approach life. And if we do that, we find ourselves not leaning into our relationship with God. I had to figure out where my faith and my fear collided in my mind. I had to take that captive. I had to realize, oh, this is the beginning of a fear. Take it captive and take it to the throne of grace. Because he wanted that fear. And it boiled down to, I didn't trust God with where things were going. I wouldn't trust God because I was afraid. It's the same thing with this idea of the Corona. Corona just seems wrong. Corona seems like a beer to me. And I want to call it something else, but it's coronavirus. We can't control that. We can trust God with it. We can put it in his hands, and we know that he's got it in his hands. He knows what's going on. He is playing it out, and we can't control it even if we want to. So fear becomes this paralyzing thing that it wasn't intended to be. Fear was meant to be cautious, take precaution, but don't let it paralyze you. Those are different things. Anyway, does that give you, I want to invite you into this idea of understanding how your mind works, because the battle is raging right there in your mind. And Lent is a season by which to disrupt those things. So we're entering Lent with the idea of we're going to join Jesus in the wilderness, per se. That's the idea. And in that, we're going to experience some hunger. And in that, we're going to experience some changes. And in that, hopefully, Jesus is showing us that the disruption of our routine allows us to get some clarity. It slows us down. It puts us into relationship with God. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to invite you into that. And as you experience temptation, we want you to, and I want to, have us all enter into that throne room of grace, experience mercy, experience the help of God, experience the idea that in that relationship with Jesus is the solution really to the questions we have. And so I'll invite you into that. I'm going to ask the band to come up. Ask if you just take a moment and look at the floor. We're going to do communion. And as we're doing communion, I just want to give you a couple of thoughts. And one is this. Part of this is doing practices. So I'm going to ask if you could just think of the one thought that you need to take captive. If you just, that one thing that you oftentimes just are passive about, but what is the thing that you need to take captive? And as we go to communion, I just want to remind you of a couple of truths about that. And one of them is this, is that when we celebrate communion, we're reminded of the cross. We're reminded of the death of Jesus, we're reminded of his body, and we're reminded of his blood. And as you go and you dip that piece of bread and by the way, it's all gluten-free, into the wine or juice, be reminded that sacrifice was a big part of this for Jesus. But also be reminded of the celebration. We know how this story ends. We know that he rose from the dead. And the power of forgiveness and the power of the cross is also overshadowed, in my opinion, by the power of the resurrection. What makes this so different is Jesus came back to life. It didn't end in the cross. It didn't end in a tomb. He came back to life. And it's that power, it's that person that we have relationship with. And he invites us into grace and mercy. And so as you are taking communion, dwell on the grace and mercy of the one who died and rose from the dead. And as you practice giving up something, be reminded, take captive your thoughts, be aware, engage the battle, engage it, because it's raging in your mind.